Hi there. I am sorry I couldn't be with you today. Unfortunately, the scheduling didn't work out, but the arrangement we have is some of you wrote down some anonymous questions on some cards, so I'm going to read those and answer them. So, a little bit about myself. I am a professor in the philosophy department. Apparently, some of you have already taken a course from me, and you've already sort of had this lecture. In fact, you sort of maybe already know the secret. But yes, I am a trans woman. And I think that's relevant to one of the questions that I have with, and the one that I'll start with. It says, when you encounter only a men's and a women's bathroom, which one do you choose to enter and why? This is an easy question. I only use the women's bathroom. I am a woman. All my identification documents, my driver's license, birth certificate, passport, everything has an F on it. So the women's bathroom is most appropriate for me, so it's the one that I use. Next question is, what are some of the major differences between gender and sex? So my understanding is that you've seen a video, I think it's a TED Talk, where someone references what we call the genderbread person. And this picture, here's what it looks like, has the gender identity placed in the mind, that it's sort of the gender that you take yourself to be, that gender expression is how you look and how you choose to sort of signal your gender to the outside world, your sort of mannerisms and clothes you wear and activities you like. And then it has sex, rather unfortunately, circled in the genitals. And the implication is that sort of gender is thought of as social and sort of in our minds, whereas sex is biology, it's in the body. We can change our gender, but it's not so easy to change our sex, even if one were to take like hormone therapy or genital surgery. Okay, that's a pretty typical view. Now, some people are familiar with referring to gender as socially constructed. What does that mean? Well, the idea is, what does it mean to be a woman? Well, that depends on where you are. That depends on the time, the social context, right? So at one point in time, women didn't have jobs. Women only wore dresses, right? Women did not wear pants, things like that. But nowadays, women wear pants. Women have jobs. Men stay at home and care for children, right? So how we define various genders shifts over time, shifts within cultures, and can be even different within a given culture. So noticing that, we think that there is no set of criteria for what it means to be a man or a woman if we're talking in terms of gender. And so that's what we mean to say that gender is socially constructed. Okay, that most people are pretty on board with that. But is there an important difference between gender, which seems social and ephemeral, and sex, which seems biological and more obvious, more objective? That there doesn't seem room for this sort of social constructionism or social constructivism in our concepts of sex. Well, it's not so simple, right? Like, sex is messy. You've also, I understand, learned what intersex means, and there's sort of an open question here. So suppose that you have someone who looks and lives and has only ever known themselves to be a woman. They have an F on their birth certificate, right? They were raised as women from birth, and no one's ever suspected anything. But it turns out that they're XY chromosome, and they have something called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So they're XY and their body's producing testosterone, but they have a condition where their body doesn't use any of it. So they develop with XY chromosomes into just a normal although usually infertile woman. Are they female? I think most of us want to say yes. And what this shows us is that there is no clear set of criteria, just like with being a woman, to being female. And then this applies just as much to being male. So biology is not neat. It isn't divided into what we call sexual dimorphism. There aren't only male and female in our species. There are intersex people, but there are also these borderline gray area cases where we want to call someone female even though they have attributes that we normally attribute to male. So because we have to socially make some decisions about which characteristics constitute being female and which ones constitute being male, recognizing that there's some gray area, we also now think that sex is socially constructed. So both gender and sex are socially constructed. It's just that they're made out of different stuff. So gender is socially constructed out of social stuff. Fashion, for example. Whereas sex is socially constructed out of physical stuff, bodies, biology, chromosomes, hormones, genitals, things like that. So the current thinking on the sex-gender relationship or sex-gender distinction is that it's not a clean distinction and that both are socially constructed but in different ways. So in a lot of cases, when I want to talk about sex or gender, I use sex/gender and just run them together because there is no clear division between them. Next question. How do you feel about laws that create separate but equal facilities for transgender people? So it depends on what this question means. Here's what I think it means. What do I think about things like single-stall lockable bathrooms that anyone can use, right? It's only one stall. You open the door, you go in, you lock the door. It's your own bathroom. There's a sink inside, right? Starbucks has these, for example. What do I think of those? Okay. Well, if the question is only what do we think of those bathrooms, they're awesome, right? I think we should have more of them. I think that people, not just trans people like single-stall lockable bathrooms. The issue happens when we have multi-stall, single-sex or single-gender bathrooms, right, men's or women's, and we have one or a number of single-stall lockable bathrooms, and we require trans people to only use the single-stall lockable, right? They're not permitted to use a bathroom in their gender. So we make trans women not allowed to use the women's bathroom, and they have to use the single-stall lockable. So what do we think of that? That's not okay. So that's what we refer to as separate but equal, and this calls back to what we know as Jim Crow laws, segregation laws with respect to race, where we had white bathrooms and black bathrooms, white water fountains and black water fountains, white schools and black schools, where a black student could not go to a white-only school. And people would say, well, you're separate, right? You're not allowed in our school, but you're equal because we have a school for you too, even though it's not quite as good, and we all know that. So you're not equal because you're separate. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in the Brown v. Board of Education decision that led to the desegregation movement, basically decided that separate but equal is never equal. It inherently stigmatizes the people who are kept separate. So when we treat people like they are inherently different, inherently not worthy of being treated just like the rest of us, that very quickly leads us to think that there's something wrong with them, and things like harassment and discrimination come along quite quickly. So there's a very real worry that we've decided that it's not okay to employ separate but equal reasoning with respect to race. We shouldn't do it with respect to gender, gender identity, trans people, especially with things like bathrooms and change rooms. So, not okay with separate but equal, well, trans people have to use single stall lockable bathrooms, gender neutral bathrooms. On their own, these things are great, but it's not okay to require trans people to only use them. The better policy is to permit trans people to use the gender in their express gender identity, and then to make more available options like single stall lockable bathrooms. And frankly, if cis people are uncomfortable with trans people using the same bathroom, they can go use those ones too. So I have a couple questions that your professor shared with me that you brought up in class, but weren't written on cards and maybe you weren't quite sure how to handle. And I have some thoughts, so I thought I would share some of these questions. The first has to do with the income disparity for trans persons. I'm not quite sure what statistics were shared, but I can talk a little bit about them. There have been a few large-scale studies of trans people focusing on harassment, discrimination of various forms, one of them being income, but also things like housing discrimination, but also things like violence. The income data that we have for trans people is that the median income is around $15,000, which those are poverty numbers. Trans people are 4 times more likely than the general population to be earning under $10,000. And the perhaps interesting thing about trans people is that they are more highly educated than the general population on average. It's extremely common for trans people to have an undergraduate degree and yet be in poverty. Why is that? A few reasons. One is people are refusing to hire trans people. So there was long a problem with things like the Social Security Agency, where if your Social Security number carried your gender and it read male, but you're a trans woman who transitioned years ago but just was unable to change your gender marker on your Social Security account, then your employer, when they tried to pay you and said, we have this person with this Social Security number who is female, here's her information, it would bounce back to the company saying, well, actually, that number is male. And that immediately outed trans people to their employers. And it is perfectly legal in nearly every city to fire a trans person for being trans. There are very few state-level protections against firing trans people for being trans. Instead, there are often city ordinances protecting trans persons. And to some extent, this is what the North Carolina fight was over, where Charlotte wanted to pass an anti-discrimination law protecting trans persons, and the state legislature flipped the table and wanted to remove the ability of a city to pass its own anti-discrimination law at the city level. So if one is lucky enough to live in a city that has passed anti-discrimination lawsuit or protections, then it's you have recourse if you're fired and you can show that your being trans was a motivating reason. One of the problems is that's extremely hard to prove, and it's usually very costly. And if trans people on average are earning less money, then they tend not to have legal resources to fight anti-discrimination suits for being fired. So on the one hand, trans people are often not hired. one justification is often, well, what will our customers think? Well, that's not so fair, right? You should be concerned about your employees too and what's fair to people. So, for example, think of if you're a masseuse and you're a trans person and you're visibly trans, then you might have a hard time finding clients because people will be like, ew, I don't want you to touch me. So it can be very hard for trans people to find work. The bigger issue tends to be that if you transition while on the job, or you get a job and then they find out you're trans, then you get fired. So the employment discrimination happens both at the level of being hired. Often it's at the level of being fired once people find out. So that's sort of the source of the income disparity, which is maybe more than you thought it was. Second question. This one's kind of hard. It has to do with a type of slippery slope argument. So if we're okay with gender transitions and people can just say, I'm a woman, and then they're a woman, well, can we change race? So if there are gender transitions, are there racial transitions? I think no. And it's not so easy to explain why, but here's a shot. So race is similar to sex in that they're both socially constructed, but built out of biological stuff. That's not the complete story, but it's sort of the quick and dirty version. Some people think that what it means to be of a particular race also carries with it a kind of social history, a kind of cultural memory of the race that you are and what people of your race have also experienced. And you can't just select into that. You can't just say, I identify as African suddenly and opt into a history that physically you are not part of. So if race is socially constructed out of biological stuff, where that biological stuff carries with it some history that matters, we think, to being of a particular race, then by just declaring that you are a particular race doesn't work conceptually. So we think that there is not a analogy between gender transitions and race transitions. So just because we think that gender transitions are okay, I hope, that doesn't mean that we are committed to thinking that racial transitions are a thing or are equal in terms of legitimacy. So we are not required to think that. We can draw a line, and I think that there's a way to do that. Okay. Here's a question that, if asked in good faith, here's my good faith answer. Here's the question. What if I want to switch back and forth between male and female at will? Then how to identify? Those people exist. And I can't, if this is a good faith question, I can't quite answer that. How someone like this identifies is up to them. Here are some options. So there are trans people who we used to refer to as transsexual and we don't anymore. The reason for that is that it's a highly medicalized term and there's a long history of medical abuse of trans persons. So the people we're talking about, people like me, where you have a gender transition, you tend to identify with one of the binary genders of man, woman, and typically when we think of trans people, that's who we're thinking of. But that's just one option. So some people are what we call genderqueer. Genderqueer people don't have a nailed down what are you answer. They identify as genderqueer. So they often incorporate what they feel best matches themselves. Genderqueer people often prefer the pronouns they, them, their, but not always. I have a bunch of genderqueer friends, and every single one of them is different. And they just found that identifying as genderqueer fit best for them. Another option is you can be agender. One word. That means that you don't identify as having any gender at all. Now, this is where the sex-gender distinction might help us, that they still have a body, they still have genitals and chromosomes and all that sort of stuff. They maybe still have sex, might be asexual, that's a sexual orientation, but many agender people are not asexual. They just say, I am neither man or woman, and I'm nothing in between. I am without a gender. Another option is you could be bigender, one word, where you identify as both genders. Often, bigender people, but not always, wear different genders on different days. Maybe they go for a week or a few days, or maybe they switch within a day. Just whatever strikes them that day as best representing who they are, that's how they roll. So someone who says, look, I want to be able to switch back and forth between male and female at will, maybe bigender. Another option is to be a cross-dresser, where I know some people, I know of a now retired philosophy professor who had two identities, has a male identity and a female identity, and would go to work some days in the female identity. And that's fine, that worked for them. They didn't identify as female though. They identified as a crossdresser. They always identified as male, they just had a female identity that they would wear when they felt like it. So one could be a cross-dresser. So you always maintain the same sex gender identity, but you like to wear a different identity when it strikes you. You could also be what we call gender fluid, where you weave in and out, back and forth between all the various options of gender. However you are feeling that day, that week, that month, whatever. So you don't have a stable gender. You're like a fluid in a cylinder where you move back and forth and in and out of categories freely. So that's another option. My favorite other option is what we call the gender fucker. And I'm quite proud that I've published a few papers with that word in it. So gender fuckers take aspects of gender that you don't expect to go together, and then they put them together to mess with your minds. So, for example, a trans woman friend of mine used to have a full beard and used to have a necklace that said gender fucker, and I thought it was amazing, right? So they might not always be a trans person, but they just like to play and mess with your minds with respect to gender. So you could be a gender fucker too. So that's my good faith answer, if this is a good faith question. I have questions though. This might be what we could call the dick question, because maybe this isn't a good faith question. That one wants to ask, well, why don't I just do whatever I want? And if I want to go look at girls get changed and shower, I'll just like not change anything about myself and walk into the women's change room and say, I'm a woman. What? What are you going to do? If that's what this is about, I don't think I have to answer that. And I'm a little concerned that when presented with an opportunity to ask a trans person whatever you wanted, and I don't know if you knew that I'm a trans woman, but sending a trans person a question with dicks written on it is not okay. Final question. This is a hard one, and it's a good one. It says, what is your suggestion for introducing transgender issues and information for the next generation? So, who's the next generation? Is it you? Is it high school? Is it grade school? Is it preschool? Who are we talking about? One question people often ask is, what about the children? Can children handle the complex realities of trans persons because they're just so weird? And people often express concern or worry that they just can't explain this to their children. It's too complicated. My experience has been the exact opposite. Children just get it. If a child asks, oh, what happened to Uncle Mike? And you're like, well, she's a woman now, and her name is Michelle. Oh, can I have a cookie? It's often that simple. Kids just get it. As long as you say, yep, she's a woman now. It is auntie, not uncle. Off you go. Kids, honestly, are not the barrier. What I see happening is that we are projecting our insecurities about trans persons and trans issues and trying to protect ourselves from having to think about and talk about these topics that we are not comfortable with, and trying to place that on children as them being uncomfortable or not ready, when it's really ourselves that are not ready. The children, I promise you, can handle it. So if we're talking about the next generation for kids, just tell it to them plain. They get it. If we're talking about maybe your friends, so we're talking about you, how do we broach this issue? I don't know. I don't have a clear answer for that. I think being mindful of what good media representations look like and starting to make yourself aware of the possible pitfalls for media representations is a very good start. So, for example, a bad media representation, transparent. Hate the show. It is a typical narrative that we don't like. It focuses on the things that cisgender people think that we care about, but we don't actually care about. It focuses on the struggles of transition rather than the day-to-day post-transition. So transitions are glorified in our culture, but the nitty-gritty day-to-day just being a person isn't what we want to focus on. It's not flashy. A much better representation is a web video series written by trans people for trans people, but for public consumption, and it's free, is called Her Story, 2 words. Highly recommend. It's a series of short episodes. You can watch the whole thing in under an hour, I think. And it picks up on a number of very subtle realities of being a trans person that most people don't even think about, and never gets into shows like Transparent. So thank you for your questions, and thank you for watching. I wanted to let you know that if you're interested in finding out more, I am teaching in the fall a special topics course. It is cross-listed between women's and gender studies and philosophy. It's an introductory course, even though the course number is WGST 320, Philosophy 298. It is an introduction to trans studies. So it is a far more in-depth, but also a far broader introduction to all these issues, and I hope to see some of you there. So thank you.